What is up, everybody? It is Rishabh here with my very first YouTube video. Today I'm going to be discussing the different types of dominance, and I'll be doing that with examples from the famous Disney show Phineas and Ferb. I'll be going over complete dominance, incomplete dominance, codominance, and then finally touching on polygenic inheritance. Now, the different types of dominance are really important concepts in genetics in general, and especially if you're in an AP biology class or an intro level biology class, you're definitely going to need to know these concepts. Now, if you're new to Mendelian genetics and have never heard of the terms dominance before, I've linked the video down in the description below that is an introduction to Mendelian genetics. So if this is completely new to you, make sure to watch that video before watching this video so that you can understand the concepts that I'm talking about. Lastly, if you've never seen Phineas and Ferb before, don't worry, you'll still be able to understand all the concepts in this video, but I highly recommend you go check it out because it is a very fun little show. Now let's get into it. So before we can talk about the different types of dominance, we need to make sure we know what dominance is. And I'm sure if you have some experience with Mendelian genetics, you already know what dominance is, but I'm just going to go over it real quick, just for review. So dominance is the concept of how alleles interact with each other to determine the physical characteristics of an individual. So what that means is I'm sure you've heard of alleles before. Alleles are essentially variants of a gene. So like the gene for hair color can either code for blonde hair, brown hair, etc. There's like many variants, right? So you get an allele for each trait. So for this video, we'll just be assuming like one allele from your mom and one allele from your dad, just to make it simpler. So you might get an allele, a brown hair allele from your father and a blonde hair allele from your mother, and essentially how those alleles interact with each other to determine what your hair color or whatever characteristic we're looking at. So some other terms you should know are genotype and phenotype. So genotype is the genetic makeup of a specific organism. So for like hair color, it's like what your actual genes say or what your alleles are. So like you have an allele for blonde and allele for brown. That's what's in your DNA, and that's the genotype. It has a root word gene, or like it's partially gene, you get that. And then phenotype is the observable characteristics of an organism as a result of its genotype and its environment. So your genotype, the alleles interact with each other to determine the phenotype. And also the environment can have a part to play in your phenotype. An example is like your skin color can be darker if you're in a really hot, sunny environment. That's just a simple example. And the last two things you should make sure you know are homozygous and heterozygous. Once again, if you've had experience with Mendelian genetics, you definitely know what these two words mean. But essentially, homozygous is when the two alleles you have are the same, and heterozygous is the two alleles you have are different. So I have a picture real quick here that'll help you understand some of that stuff. So as we can see, the genotype for C stands for color here. You have the blue genotype from one parent and the blue genotype from the other. And as you can see, no matter what type of dominance you have, it's always the same color. Same for yellow. So these are the two homozygous examples, when the two alleles are the same. However, you'll notice that when you have a heterozygous example, so the two alleles are different, you see that the phenotype of the color of the little ball here is different with different types of dominance. So in this video, when we discuss different types of dominance, we're only talking about the heterozygous example, not the homozygous example. So just make sure to keep that in mind. When something is homozygous, that's the trait that's going to be represented. Alright, so now let's get into the different types of dominance. First form of dominance we're going to talk about is complete dominance. Now this is the, the classic form of dominance that you've probably learned about in like a middle school science class when you did Punnett squares and stuff. So this is pretty simple, and I'm sure most of you have heard of it, but it's a type of dominance, so I'm still going to go over it. So essentially, complete dominance is the form of dominance where, in a heterozygous case, the allele that is known to be dominant masks the recessive allele. So let's look at an example with flowers. So we have the big A allele codes for purple, the little a allele codes for white, and in the heterozygous case, the big A is known to be dominant over the little a, so purple trait is dominant over the white trait, and we can see that in the heterozygous case, the plant is completely purple and you see no evidence of white in the phenotype, even though it still exists in the genotype. Now let's look at an example from the actual Phineas and Ferb series. So in the Phineas and Ferb series, Phineas's mother is known to be Linda, who's on the left here. However, his father is, or his biological father is unknown, and that's one of the mysteries in the Phineas and Ferb series. Now, online, there's a very popular conspiracy theory that states that Doofenshmirtz, another one of the main characters in Phineas and Ferb, is actually Phineas's father. There's a lot of evidence for this, and I personally buy into the theory, and I encourage, if you're interested in that, you go look it up and come to your own conclusion. But for the sake of this video, we're going to assume Doofenshmirtz is indeed Phineas's father to help explain some of these biological concepts. Alright, now let's get into the actual genetic stuff. So the trait we're going to be discussing for complete dominance is going to be the hair color. So I've constructed a Punnett square in the corner here, and there's actually many different Punnett squares possible for this scenario here, but I'm using this one to help explain complete dominance in this case. So over here we have the homozygous red genotype, and that's Linda's genotype, and then the homozygous brown genotype is Doofenshmirtz's genotype. And when you cross them, so when they reproduce, you can see that no matter what, the phenotype is RB, so thus that's what Phineas's genotype is going to be. But as you can see is that Phineas's hair color is completely red. You don't see any hint of brown at all. It's just completely red, so that tells us that the red is completely dominant over the brown, and that's how you can tell this is a case of complete dominance. Alright, so let's dig into another type of dominance called incomplete dominance. So by definition, incomplete dominance is a form of dominance that, in a heterozygous case, neither allele masks the other, and rather the phenotype shows a blending of both alleles. So I have an image to help us make sense of this definition, and in this image, or in this Punnett square, what you can see is that we have a homozygous red flower is being crossed with a homozygous white flower to produce these offspring. And you'll notice that the offspring, instead of being red or white, which would be the case in a complete dominance scenario, they're actually pink, which shows the blending between the red and white. So you know when you mix red and white, you get pink. That's essentially what's happening here, and that is incomplete dominance, where in the heterozygous case, the two alleles essentially mix to produce the phenotype. And now this is a really common example, the red, white, pink flowers. That's probably what you'll see in your biology textbook. But I also have another example from Phineas and Ferb that is a little bit different, but still exhibits incomplete dominance. So once again, we'll be talking about Doofenshmirtz and Linda, but this time we'll be talking about Candace. Now, Candace is known to be Phineas's complete sibling, and thus we know that Linda is Candace's biological mother. And since they're complete siblings, Candace and Phineas must share a father, but that biological father is unknown. Now, using the theory we had from before, we're going to use that Doofenshmirtz is indeed Candace's father also to help us explain incomplete dominance. Now, I'm going to be honest, this isn't the best example of incomplete dominance. I think that if you're trying to memorize something for a quiz or learn this for a test or something like that, definitely use the red, white, pink example, because that's really easy to remember and it happens in real life. However, I think this is just a good little example to try and tie in genetics and Phineas and Ferb. Now, Doofenshmirtz has a head shape that's very triangular, as you can see here. And Linda's head shape is it's not as long, and it's more rounded in the front and kind of like arched in the back, I guess. And Candace's head shape, you'll notice, is kind of an intermediate between the two. It still tries to conform to this longer, like pointier Doofenshmirtz's head, but at the same time, it tries to maintain Linda's roundedness, and yeah, like you can see that it's extending outward, but it's still maintaining that roundedness. And here I have a Punnett square that shows that when you cross the triangular homozygous for Doofenshmirtz and the circular homozygous for Linda, then you get the heterozygote, and you see an intermediate between the two alleles, which is a form of incomplete dominance. Alright, so let's talk about the next form of dominance, and that is codominance. So, codominance is a form of dominance that, in a heterozygous case, neither allele masks the other, and rather, contributions of both alleles are visible in the phenotype. So let's look at an image to help us explain this. So here we have a homozygous white cow being crossed with a homozygous brown cow, and in the offspring, you'll notice that both brown and white are visible in the offspring. So both alleles are visible in the phenotype. And this is really important to notice the difference between codominance and incomplete dominance. Because in incomplete dominance, you would have seen the brown and white mix, and you wouldn't see either the brown or the white in the offspring. However, in codominance, you can see both of them, and they're both like scattered, as you can see the brown spots on the white cow. Now, a really important example for codominance that you have to know is in our blood types, AB, ABO, the different types of blood types. Now, I encourage you to pause the video real quick and look at all these different genotypes and what they look like. But the one I'll focus on is the heterozygous genotype here for the antigens that are located on the red blood cell. You'll see that in the heterozygote, you see both the A antigens and the B antigens in the heterozygote. Now let's look at an example from Phineas and Ferb. Alright, so unlike in complete dominance and incomplete dominance, where there's pretty good analogies for both of them in the Phineas and Ferb series that I shared earlier in this video, the codominance example really doesn't have a good analogy in the Phineas and Ferb world. And so this next little thing I'm going to share, it's not the greatest example of codominance. So like if you're studying for a test, please use the cow example I shared. But I'm just going to share this example anyway because I think it's a good little theory of how codominance could exist in Phineas and Ferb. So we have Ferb here on the bottom, and Ferb's biological father is known to be Fletcher here on the left. However, his biological mother is completely unknown, and there's no really good theories out there like the Doofenshmirtz theory that exists for Ferb. So his mother is pretty much completely unknown. However, Ferb's overall head shape is very similar to his father's. However, his mouth and eyes are very different, leading me to think those characteristics came from his mother. So I think when we're talking about his head as a whole, so including eyes, mouth, nose, and stuff, I think there is codominance at play here. Because you notice that his head shape is very similar to Ferb's head shape is very similar to his father's. However, things like his mouth and eyes are very different. So I like to think that those characteristics came from his mother. So what you're seeing here is in terms of the way the head is formed, you're seeing that he has both characteristics of his father and of his mother, and that would be codominance in this case, because you're not seeing mixing, and rather you're seeing both of them appearing in the offspring's phenotype. But this, once again, isn't the greatest example, so if you're trying to study for a test, use the cow example, because that's in the real world, and it's much easier to understand and remember. Alright, so we've talked about all these different forms of dominances, and I'm sure you've noticed that in all of these forms of dominance that we talked about, it's just two alleles or two genes interacting with each other. However, the reality is that most of our traits, like height, skin color, etc., are not determined just by two genes, but rather by several, and that's what polygenic inheritance is. So polygenic inheritance is a form of inheritance where multiple genes make a small contribution to the overall outcome, and some examples, like I said, are height, hair color, and skin color. Now, in a AP biology class or intro level biology class, you're not going to be asked to make any predictions based off polygenic inheritance. You just need to know what it is and some of the traits that exhibit it. And just for a fun fact is that your height is actually determined by over 400 genes. And that's kind of the reason why doctors can't really predict your height exactly. Like, they can give you a range usually, but they can't tell you, oh, you're going to be 5'11" when you grow up. And that's because there's simply so many genes at play, and it's really hard to keep track of every single one of them. And that is an example of polygenic inheritance. And also here we have a picture of polygenic inheritance being done for skin color. So just make sure you know that in reality most traits are determined by polygenic inheritance. Alright, so let's do a real quick review of the concepts we learned in this video, and we'll go back to the image from the beginning of the video. So of course we talked about complete dominance first, and that's just when in the heterozygous case, the allele known to be dominant completely masks the allele known to be recessive, in this case leading to a blue little ball thing here. In incomplete dominance, which is what we talked about next, they blend together, so you see the blue and yellow alleles mix, and when you mix blue and yellow you obviously get green, and that's what you see here. And then of course codominance, they don't mix with each other, but rather you can see both of them, both of the colors in the offspring, and you see kind of this scattered yellow over blue thing. And remember the cow example from the earlier part in the video. And just want to make sure you don't get codominance and incomplete dominance confused, because that's where a lot of mistakes can occur on tests and stuff. So just remember this image, or the cow and the flower. And finally, we talked about polygenic inheritance, which is the way most of our traits are determined, and that's when more than two genes interact with each other to determine things like your height, hair color, etc. Thank you guys for making it to the end of the video. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe button to help support the channel. If you have any questions about the concepts that I went over in this video, make sure to leave them down in the comments and I will respond to them. Additionally, if you have any other concepts in biology or math or any other STEM related thing you would like me to go over, make sure to leave those down in the comments below, and I will maybe make a video about it depending on what the concept is. Lastly, since this is my first YouTube video, I could really use some feedback on how to make my videos better. So if you have any advice, make sure to drop those in the comments down below. Thank you guys.
Oh, great, a line! Oh, brother, what is this, a model of Pluto? That planet doesn't even exist anymore, you moron!
Thanks for holding my spot in line, little brother. What were you saying about Pluto?
Nothing, I'm sure it's